Air Gallet blows your socks off.
That it certainly does. Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the 16-Bit Thief podcast. As per usual, I am your host, Jake Melvin. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear this particular sound effect?
All your base are belong to us.
This, for those who don't know, is Zero Wing, a horizontal shooter released by Toaplan in 1989. I mentioned Toaplan back when I interviewed Yasushi Kamenishi from Takumi Corporation and how Takumi was splintered off from Toaplan after their closure in 1994. But I never really divulged onto all of what Toaplan made during their time, and I was always kind of curious on what happened to the fate of some of the workers who disappeared after Toaplan closed their doors. We do know that some of these workers later went on to work at development studio Rising, Cave, and short-lived company Gazelle. Now Gazelle only made 2 titles, Air Gallet and Pretty Soldier Sailor Moon, as well as porting Toaplan's shooter and also believed to be the first bullet hell title, Batsugun, to the Sega Saturn. Gazelle went defunct in 1996, with both titles remaining arcade exclusives despite their awesomeness. Uemura would later go on to work at Rising on Battle Backrate and Daimahu before leaving the industry to become a musician. I wanted to inquire more about his time at Toaplan and beyond, so I contacted him to ask him some questions about game development and being a musician. But before we move on to the interview, I have to confess that this episode was actually not a solo production this time. The interview was translated by friend of Uemura, Joseph Pierce. I believe that's his last name. He's a diehard Toaplan fan and has even had some boards signed by former Toaplan staff like Masahiro Yuge. Be sure to give him a huge round of applause for bridging the language barrier, which I was afraid would happen. Now do note that this interview will not feature questions about Zero Wing, as believe it or not, Uemura actually does not like that game, and I'll be only using it for a few sound effects. In any case, let's move on to the interview, shall we? Let's start with the first question. Air Gallet was an awesome game that really did blow my socks off, but why did it never receive a home port? Was it due to licensing issues with Banpresto or financial reasons? Well, Uemura says that he's had many interviews, but up until this point, nobody has ever asked him about Air Gallet. He says that the game didn't sell so well, so he thinks that very few people knew about it, and it especially didn't sell well overseas. He thought that it would only hurt their business to make a home version of it, so they unfortunately didn't make a home port. On another note, he is very happy that I played it and thanked me very much. Question number 2. Air Gallet is one of the few Japanese shooters I've ever played that has an English voice track, featuring Len Hart and Jeff Manning, who are English-speaking actors located in Japan. Was this a development decision to make the game stand out amongst its peers? The reason why Gazelle had natives do the voices was simply because it sounded cooler to them. When we hear Japanese in games and movies, doesn't it sound a bit more exotic? There are a few other games that do have English tracks too, but Dawnpatch is the only one that comes to mind. Question number 3. Gazelle was an offshoot of Toaplan, like Takumi, Cave, and Rising, the latter of which you worked on Battle Backrate and Great Mahou Daisakusen. Yet Gazelle only produced 2 titles and ported a Toaplan title to the Sega Saturn, Air Gallet, Sailor Moon, and Batsugun respectively. Why did Gazelle have such a short lifespan compared to these other companies? Early into their history, Cave had made Dodanpatch and Rising had made Mahou Daisakusen and Battle Garega. These early hits were a big reason why they were so successful. Gazelle, on the other hand, was originally a company that sold used games to customers overseas. Right from the start, Gazelle had difficulty in making a hit game, and that didn't change once he had joined the company. Small companies like Gazelle can't last unless they have a hit game right out of the gate. Question number 4. Batsugun was Toaplan's penultimate title before Snow Bros. 2 and was the last Toaplan game to get a home port, I believe. I have heard rumors that the source code of Batsugun is long lost. If you did work on the porting project of Batsugun, is it true that the source code is long gone? Uemura says that not only Batsugun, but the majority of their titles' source codes were lost when Toaplan went bankrupt. You would have to extract the code from the arcade board's ROM, which he believes that there are emulators that can now do this kind of thing. Question number 5. Do you keep in contact with fellow Toaplan, Gazelle, or Rising devs after your years of work? Certain devs like Shinobu Yagawa, Joker Junya Inoue, or Masahiro Yuge? I know that some Toaplan workers such as Yuko Tataka, Yoshitatsu Sakai, and Takeshi Kawamoto have not been heard from since the 1990s. Mr. Masahiro Yuge is the only person that he's in regular contact with. He comes to his concerts every time, and he even recently started his own development company called Tatsujin. It's kind of disappointing, but almost no one now who worked on games at Toaplan is currently making games. Unfortunately, he hasn't kept in contact with other Toaplan staff either. He does know that Shinichi Ikeda now works for Cave, and there are maybe 2 to 3 people tops still in the industry. The man who made Battle Garega, Shinobu Yagawa, is now working for Cave, though he did not work for Toaplan. Question number 6. I noticed that you were quite the accomplished musician, composing for titles such as Tiger Heli, Flying Shark, and Zero Wing. What exactly are your musical influences, and what do you look for when you compose these projects? Uemura says that he likes 1980s hard rock songs that have good melodies to them. Bands like Journey, Van Halen, Night Ranger, Bon Jovi, Boston, Queen, and Europe. All of those types of bands fill him with excitement, and he feels that hard rock is perfect for shooters and wrote music with bands like that in mind. But at the time, the hardware wasn't able to produce sounds with the impact he wanted, so now with his band, he's able to realize what he was trying to achieve back during his days at Toaplan. Question number 7. Both Moby Games and Wikipedia list you as a programmer on Battle Backrate, which is the third entry in the unofficial Battle Garega trilogy. Do you know exactly how the ranking system was established? This is actually a misconception that there's any relation between Rising and Toaplan's development team. Toaplan simply supported them because they wanted to make shooting games. That's why they used their hardware on Sorcerer Striker and Battle Garega. While he worked at Gazelle, he came to be close friends with the staff at Rising. That's how he ended up collaborating with them for a little while after leaving Gazelle. He made the sound driver for Battle Backrate but had no other involvement in making the game, so he unfortunately doesn't know anything about the ranking system. Question number 8. Out of all the titles that you've worked on, what do you rank as your magnum opus? And is there a certain genre of music that you prefer doing the most? The games that he likes to play the most are Hishozame and Kyokyu Tiger. However, he doesn't like Twin Cobra because it allows you to respawn right where you were shot down instead of sending you back to a checkpoint. He feels that ruined the strategy of the game. But of all the games he has made, he has had the strongest emotional attachment to Outzone. It was such a struggle to make the game interesting because it was the first time Toaplan had ever produced a run-and-gun type shooter. The background music is also slower than the other games to match the game's style, but overall he likes how the music turned out. Question number 9. Why did Toaplan close their doors? I've never been able to find sourced reasons on why. When Toaplan started off, they produced a number of hit shooting games which allowed them to hire more staff and expand. But puzzle games, fighting games, and other genres started to gain popularity, while Toaplan was only ever able to make hit shooting games. This is ultimately why they went out of business. On top of that, the skill of shooting game players increased over time, forcing them to ramp up the difficulty with each title that they produced. Shooting games as a genre became more and more inaccessible to the casual player and were only meant for hardcore players, which is another reason why they went out of business. The 10th and final question I had to ask him was that Great Mahou Daisaku-sen featured Chitta the Witch, Miyamoto the Samurai, and Gain the Warrior, but Bornham the Necromancer was absent. Why exactly was he not available? Well, as mentioned above, Rising's development team isn't related to Toaplan, so he doesn't really know anything about Great Mahou Daisaku-sen's development. But he did ask Yoichi Toyama, who happens to be his friend, and he replied that because of the development schedule, they had to place preference on including the more popular characters instead of somebody like Bornham, who wasn't very popular. So sadly, he had to be cut. The main reason I asked this question was because Uemura was listed as staff on the game, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to get some insight.
Mission completed!
You did it!
Well, that's about it for me today. Again, I want to thank Joseph Pierce for translating these questions and Tatsuya Uemura for answering them. When he said that nobody had ever asked him about Air Gallet before, it made me swell with joy. That's why I do this podcast. I want developers to be able to give their side of the story. And it was also to clear up some good misconception about Rising and Cave's relation to Toaplan, which was apparently minimal. It's information that I feel people should know when discussing video game history, because that's what all of this is about, showing how history of video games was made. Thanks again for listening to my podcast, and for those of you who supported me, and be sure to check in for the next episode in which I interview former Irem and Nazca sound director Takushi Hiyamuta. Until next time, this is the 16-Bit Thief, signing off.